What is going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, back with an NFL debate to start off the 2019 NFL offseason. I love to do these NFL debates during the offseason. Haven't done one in a while, and I know it's a very popular series on the channel, so I'm bringing it back full time as much as I can during this offseason. We're going to start it off with the examination of Julian Edelman. Julian Edelman has been discussed recently as being a Hall of Fame football player, and I think there is a fair case for that to be said. He's a clutch receiver. The biggest moments, Julian Edelman shows up. He's a three-time Super Bowl champion, a Super Bowl MVP, and one of the best playoff receivers of all time. But my question here is Julian Edelman actually the greatest playoff receiver in NFL history? I'm going to debate Jerry Rice versus Julian Edelman. Not their full career, but just postseason play. And we're going to examine who the greater postseason playoff performer is in NFL history. Who is the greatest playoff receiver of all time? Edelman or Rice? Before I get into the video, make sure you Gronk spike that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for NFL debates just like this, NFL videos all year long. And comment your opinion below. Do you think it's Edelman? Do you think he surpassed Jerry Rice? Or do you think Jerry Rice is still the greatest playoff receiver of all time? Okay, let's get into it. So let's start off with games played, because it's important to provide context to the statistical output for each player. Jerry Rice has played in 29 playoff games, or played in 29 playoff games throughout the course of his NFL career. That is in the top 5 all time for players. I believe that's second or third overall. I think it's behind Tom Brady, Adam Vinatieri, and Jerry Rice ranks third. So Jerry Rice played a lot of games in the playoffs. 29 games in the playoffs. Julian Edelman, he's played a lot too. He hasn't played 29. He's played 18 games in the playoffs. That's still a lot, but not quite as many as Jerry Rice. Jerry Rice has played overall like another 3 trips to the Super Bowl, or 4 trips to the Super Bowl more than Julian Edelman, depending on if you played in the wild card or not. So that being said, Rice has a lot more action in the playoffs, and he was a player that played for a very long time. Also, Edelman, he's a player that he did miss some time with injuries in certain seasons, and also his career isn't over yet, and also he wasn't really a starter for many years before he really became a full-time starter in 2013. Playoff receptions, Jerry Rice is first all-time, Julian Edelman is second all-time. Jerry Rice has 151 overall career receptions in the playoffs. Julian Edelman, 115. Receptions per game. Jerry Rice is actually below Julian Edelman. Edelman is actually the leader over Rice in this category. 6.4 receptions per game in the playoffs. Jerry Rice only 5.2, so significantly about 1 more or 2 more receptions per game than Jerry Rice. Looking at the yardage totals, Jerry Rice 2,245, which leads all players by quite a far margin, because Julian Edelman ranks second in that category with 1,412. Now, considering the games played and considering the action so far in Edelman's career, that's pretty impressive total, because when you look at the yards per game, Edelman actually leads Rice in this category. Jerry Rice had 77 yards per game in the playoffs, while Julian Edelman has 78. So 1 yard more than Jerry Rice in his playoff career. So Edelman, if he does continue to play for probably a few more seasons, he would end up surpassing Jerry Rice. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I think that Edelman will get pretty close. Looking at touchdowns, though, Jerry Rice is for sure the big-time leader in this category over Edelman with 22 receiving touchdowns. 5 for Edelman. Edelman is not a touchdown guy. He is not a guy that catches a lot of touchdowns. That's going to be Rob Gronkowski. That's going to be James White. That's going to be even Danny Amendola in certain cases in the past, but not really Julian Edelman. He's more of the chain mover. He's the guy that really gets a lot of receptions, a lot of yards, but not a ton of touchdowns, and that's where Jerry Rice separates himself in this statistical category. When looking at touchdowns per game, Rice is about every 3 out of 4 games he would score a touchdown. So 0.76, 76% of the time, Rice would score a touchdown, while Julian Edelman is more around 1 in every 4 games, 25%, at about 28% of the time Julian Edelman will score a touchdown. Now, those are their overall statistics per game and overall career statistics. When looking at that and measuring it up, Edelman is probably the better per game player at this point in his career. Now, his career isn't over, and those certainly could go down in the per game average as Julian Edelman will continue to age, and they probably will. But when looking at Jerry Rice, he just played a lot of playoff games, which not a lot of people really think about. You know, he was on some great 49ers teams, but everybody looks at his numbers and think they're kind of insurmountable. But if a receiver one day were to come across Jerry Rice and play about the same amount of games as Jerry Rice in the playoffs, I think they would surpass his records pretty comfortably as well. So when looking at those totals, Julian Edelman makes a very interesting case as a per game player having more production than Jerry Rice, but Jerry Rice does have the career totals. Now, when looking at the best postseasons for each player, Jerry Rice does have probably the best receiving season in any statistical context when looking at a wide receiver in the postseason. 1988 was his best season. He had 21 receptions, 409 yards, and 6 touchdowns in that postseason. 6 touchdowns and 409 yards. Very, very impressive. And Rice had an excellent Super Bowl that year. He had just an overall excellent run. And that was about the time where people were starting to realize, wow, this guy is really, really special. When looking at Julian Edelman, his best postseason was this past postseason, 2019. Now, he didn't even score a touchdown in this postseason, but what was impressive was his reception totals. He had 26 receptions this postseason, which is 5 more than Jerry Rice did have in 1988. Edelman also had 388 yards, which is very comparable to 409 yards. Considering that game against the Chargers, he probably would have had near 200 yards if it wasn't such a blowout. And really, you know, looking at that, Edelman probably could have added more yards to that total. But overall, Jerry Rice's best season does surpass Julian Edelman's best season. I think it would be interesting to take a look at the second best season ever, while Julian Edelman's is probably 2016, maybe even 2014. Jerry Rice's is probably 89, but it's very close when you start to go down. Jerry Rice's 1988 is just phenomenal, and you can't go against it. That is the best season for both players. Super Bowl stats, Jerry Rice again is just insurmountable in this category. Jerry Rice was phenomenal in Super Bowls. Now, that being said, there were a couple of these games were absolute blowouts, and Julian Edelman has never been able to be in a blowout, a game where he can just put up statistics for no reason. And the same could be said for Jerry Rice, that he really wasn't putting up stats in the fourth quarter. So, you know, same. But Jerry Rice, looking at these numbers, 11 catches, 215 yards, and 1 touchdown. That was probably the best receiving performance in a Super Bowl history. He won the Super Bowl MVP for that performance, and it goes down still as that performance being the best by a receiver in a Super Bowl. Jerry Rice also has 2 amazing other games that are very comparable. One, 7 catches for 148 yards and 3 touchdowns, and another with 10 catches for 149 yards and 3 touchdowns. In both of those games were both blowouts. He had 3 touchdowns in both of those blowout games. One was with Young, one was with Montana. I believe it was 89 and 94 were the 2 seasons that those were blowout Super Bowls. And then the other Super Bowl was when they played the Bengals. It was a very close Super Bowl, but Rice clutched it up with 11 catches for 215 yards. So Rice is the best best Super Bowl receiver of all time with those numbers, totaling 512 yards in a Super Bowl on 28 catches and 7 total touchdowns. Phenomenal. Looking at Julian Edelman, he is probably one of the best Super Bowl receivers of all time. 9 catches, 109 yards, and a touchdown in the Seattle Seahawks game, where many would argue, including my buddy AC, he would say that Edelman probably should have been the MVP of that game, with 2 of the biggest, most memorable plays in that game. The first one being the game-winning touchdown against the Seahawks, playing the Legion of Boom. The 49ers never had to play a defense like that in the Super Bowl. And then looking at that other play where he gets crushed on 3rd down, helmet to helmet, looked like he was concussed, and continued to move the chains after getting hit by Cam Chancellor. 2 of the most epic plays in that Super Bowl. And then the next game against Atlanta, he has arguably the greatest catch in Super Bowl history against the Falcons with that incredible snag over 3 people, just phenomenal. And that game, he actually really didn't have like an MVP caliber performance, but he just made a few ginormous plays in that game, including that catch against Atlanta that really started to cement him as a playoff legend there in 2016-2017. So Edelman, 5 catches, 87 yards against Atlanta, 109 and a touchdown against Seattle. And then this past season against the Rams, 10 catches, 141 yards against the LA Rams, and a Super Bowl MVP, by far the best player in this game offensively for New England, and the Super Bowl MVP for a reason. And I think something going back to this conversation is that the fact that Edelman really has been the go-to guy for Tom Brady for probably the past like three seasons, like 2016 to 2018 now, where he did miss the season in 2017. He's been the go-to guy. You would have to say in 2014, 2013, it was still Rob Gronkowski, but Edelman was the go-to guy in the 2013 playoffs because Rob Gronkowski was injured. And in 2014, he became more crucial to the game plan against a team like Seattle, who had a harder time stopping slot receivers and not necessarily a hard time stopping tight ends. Even though Gronk played well in that game, it's still to say that Edelman has had to deal with Gronk and some of the other weapons, while Jerry Rice, in his own right, has been the #1 go-to guy his whole career. And in all these games, he was the guy to get the ball. So in a way, it helps Edelman, but in a way, it helps Rice. Rice was always the go-to guy, always the guy making the plays. Edelman had help around him to make plays and take coverage away from him, as at the same time as being a guy that wasn't always the guy asked to catch the football in the clutch situation, but just always found a way to do so. So there's 2 ways of looking at that argument. Then we go to Julian Edelman, 2 games in the top 12 in yards, or sorry, 2 seasons in the top 12 in yards in NFL history in the postseason, which was 2016 and now this season. And Jerry Rice had only 2 in the top 19. So that goes back to the argument of, okay, Jerry Rice's best season was the best season ever, but maybe Larry Fitzgerald's actually on second thought, but don't worry about that. The debate is also, okay, Rice's second season doesn't really measure up to where Edelman's second season is. So Edelman, I think, has a better first, second, third season in the playoffs, but Rice has a better first season in the playoffs, with his second season not being as great. When looking at games over 100 yards, Rice has 8 games over 100 yards. Keep in mind, this is in 29 games, so 8 over 100 yards, and then Edelman had 6 over 100 yards in only 18 games played. So 1 out of every 3 games Edelman plays in the playoffs, he's going to catch 100 yards. Then when we look at 80-yard games, Edelman is unbelievable. 11 games Julian Edelman has had 80 or more yards in the playoffs. 11 games out of 18. Jerry Rice only had 10 80-yard games. That was in 29 games. When looking at touchdowns, though, Jerry Rice has more multi-touchdown games, 5 multi-touchdown games. I believe 2 of those coming in the Super Bowl. Julian Edelman only ever had 1, and that was actually in his rookie season in 2009, and he wasn't really even a starter then. When looking at external attributes and kind of arguments, Julian Edelman has been more of a player that has been utilized all around for his football team. He has 69 rushing yards in his playoff career, while Rice has 44. He also threw a touchdown pass against the Baltimore Ravens in the 2014 season in that divisional round, and without that touchdown pass, you could argue the Patriots don't go on to win the Super Bowl that season. Edelman also has 443 punt return yards, averaging over 11 yards per punt return. Pretty good overall. And honestly, Edelman has been one of the best punt returners in the league since he came in, and he's done that in the playoffs as well. Never had a touchdown in the playoffs, but has been pretty consistent in punt return yardage. Edelman also in the 2011 season, before again becoming a full-time receiver in the offense, played defensive back for the Patriots, also caused a forced fumble in the AFC Championship game of that season against the Ravens. So these are some context to throw into the argument here that Edelman has kind of been a more all-around weapon. Now, we also can factor in the records, and this may change your stance, but Julian Edelman as a player for the Patriots is 13-5 in the playoffs. And keep in mind, 3 of those losses did come when he was not the starter. So he wasn't a every down impact player. So technically he's 13-2 in the playoffs, losing both times to the Broncos in Denver in the AFC Championship game. When looking at Jerry Rice, he's only 17-12 in the playoffs. Still pretty good, but not as dominant as Julian Edelman has been able to be with the Patriots when he's on New England in the playoffs. So if you factor in and you think that the receiver has a responsibility to the record of a team, then maybe you feel like Julian Edelman is the better playoff receiver, because when they're on the field, most times they win, if not for 2 AFC Championship games in Denver. And for Jerry Rice, his team, even though he gets the stats, it doesn't really show through with some of the victories he's had in his career. So it's interesting, this debate of who the best playoff receiver is of all time. I am slightly edging to Jerry Rice just because of those Super Bowl performances. But how do you guys feel about this? Do you think that Edelman has surpassed Rice already as the best playoff receiver of all time? Do you think Edelman should be a Hall of Famer? And also, are you on the side of Jerry Rice? Let me know in the comment section below. Gronk, spike that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's Mitch of TheBottomLineView. Thanks, guys, for being here for another debate video. We'll have many more to come. Peace out.